The wind that morning carried a chill only the Carolina pines could hold. A soft mist rolled down from the hills, weaving between the gravestones of Willow Creek Memorial Chapel. The little church sat at the edge of town, its white paint fading, its bell tower leaning just slightly toward the forest, as if bowing to time itself. Inside, the scent of cedar polish and old hymn books filled the air. Daniel Ross, now 55, stood quietly in the back row, his broad shoulders stooped not from age, but from years that had left their mark. His once dark hair was streaked with silver, his face weathered and still. The Marine uniform he wore didn't quite fit like it used to, yet he wore it anyway out of respect. Beside him, sitting tall and silent, was Shadow, his German shepherd, a soldier in his own right. The dog's coat shimmered dark bronze under the chapel light, his ears alert, his eyes locked forward on the flag-draped casket at the altar. The man inside that casket, or so they believed, was Colonel Richard Cole Daniels' former commanding officer, mentor, and friend. Cole had been the kind of leader men followed without question, decisive, proud, and fearless. 2 days ago they said he'd died suddenly, cardiac arrest at his lake house. A quiet ending for a man who had commanded so much noise in his lifetime. As the organ played "Nearer, My God, to Thee," Daniel kept his eyes on the casket, but his mind drifted to the past. He remembered the desert heat, Cole's steady voice in the radio headset, and that one night when Shadow, just a pup then, had saved their entire unit from an ambush. They had all come home scarred but alive. The Reverend's voice broke through the silence. Colonel Richard Cole served his country with honor and courage. May the Lord receive him in peace. A faint murmur rippled through the rows of uniforms and dark suits. Daniel lowered his head. Shadow did not. The dog's ears flicked once, then twice, and a low rumble built in his throat. "Easy, boy," Daniel whispered, pressing a calming hand against the shepherd's neck. But Shadow didn't ease. His muscles tightened. His nostrils flared as if he'd caught a scent that no one else could. The Reverend continued his prayer, oblivious. But then Shadow gave a sharp bark that echoed through the chapel like a gunshot. Gasps followed. A few soldiers turned their heads, frowning. "Ross, control your dog," someone hissed from the front row. Daniel stood frozen. Shadow wasn't acting out, he was alert, focused, staring straight at the coffin. His growl deepened into a warning. Before Daniel could react, the dog lunged forward, the leash snapping free from his hand. "Shadow, heel." The shepherd bounded up the aisle, claws scraping against the wooden floor, scattering petals from the flower wreaths. He leapt onto the platform and began to paw at the casket, whining, then growling, urgent, not wild. Panic spread. A woman screamed. 2 soldiers moved to pull the dog back, but Daniel raised a hand. "Wait!" he shouted. "Let him be!" The room fell silent except for the sound of Shadow's nails clicking against the polished wood. The dog began to bark again, short, controlled bursts, his gaze fixed on the flag-draped coffin as though trying to tell them something. The funeral director hesitated. "Mr. Ross, this is highly irregular." "Open it," Daniel said quietly. "Sir, open the casket." For a moment no one moved. Then, perhaps because of the authority still lingering in Daniel's voice, 2 pallbearers stepped forward. They unlatched the brass clasps and lifted the lid halfway. The air changed. A hush so deep filled the chapel that even the wind outside seemed to stop. Inside the casket lay Colonel Cole, his skin pale as marble, lips bluish, but then faintly, unmistakably, his chest rose. A collective gasp tore through the room. Someone dropped their hymn book. A young soldier shouted for a medic. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs as he knelt beside the casket. Cole's pulse was weak, but it was there, a slow, stubborn thump. Shadow stood beside him, now silent again, tail still. His amber eyes never left Cole's face. Outside, the church bell began to toll 12 slow chimes that rolled over the misty town. As paramedics rushed in, Daniel looked once more at the dog that had refused to stay silent. "You saved him," he whispered. But even as he said it, something unsettled him. Cole's pulse was faint but steady. His skin wasn't cold enough for a man who'd been dead 2 days, and there was no sign of rigor at all. Daniel straightened slowly, glancing toward the doorway where a few men in dark suits stood watching. Not grieving, not shocked, just waiting. One of them met his eyes and gave the smallest nod before turning away. A chill passed through Daniel that had nothing to do with the weather. Shadow pressed against his leg, growling low. Somewhere in his gut, Daniel knew this was no miracle. It was the beginning of something far worse. The sirens cut through the mist as the ambulance raced down Willow Creek Road. Daniel followed close behind in his old pickup, the engine growling against the wind. Shadow sat in the passenger seat, his body tense, eyes fixed ahead. The town blurred past closed diners, dark windows, the still water of the creek reflecting the flashing red lights. They arrived at Willow Creek Military Medical Center, a low gray building left over from another era. The walls smelled of antiseptic and rain. Soldiers moved in quiet efficiency, but their eyes avoided one another as if they already knew too much. Inside the emergency ward, Colonel Richard Cole was alive barely. Doctors surrounded him, their voices clipped and urgent. Machines beeped steadily. The air felt heavy like a secret pressing down on everyone. Daniel stood just outside the glass partition, his reflection overlapping with Cole's still body. He remembered a man who once shouted orders over mortar fire, who once risked everything for his men. But the man lying there now looked peaceful, too peaceful, like someone who had planned his own escape. A woman in a teal uniform approached, her hair tied back in a practical knot. Her badge read, Dr. Evelyn Ward. Her face was calm, but her eyes carried the weariness of someone who'd seen too many soldiers drift between life and death. Mr. Ross, she asked softly. You were at the funeral? Daniel nodded. That's right. He was my commanding officer. She hesitated. Then you should know what happened out there wasn't natural. Evelyn led him to a side room away from the noise. She laid out a thin manila folder on the table. His vitals are erratic. He's stable now, but when we first checked his blood work, I found traces of a synthetic compound, something we used to study in classified military medicine. It slows. The heart drops body temperature and mimics death. Daniel frowned. You're saying he was poisoned? In a sense, she said, but not fatally. This wasn't meant to kill. It was meant to hide. Shadow gave a low growl beside Daniel's chair. Evelyn glanced down, uneasy. He doesn't like hospitals, Daniel muttered, trying to sound calm, but his own pulse was racing. Mr. Ross. Evelyn continued, lowering her voice. This isn't the first time I've seen that compound. Years ago, a field medic mentioned it being tested for covert extractions, making a man appear dead so he could disappear. But it was shelved. Too dangerous. Too easy to abuse. Daniel leaned back, eyes narrowing. And someone used it on Cole. She nodded slowly. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. A silence settled between them, thick and uneasy. The sound of rain tapping on the window filled the room. Then Evelyn added, almost reluctantly, There's something else. When we ran his identification through the database, the system flagged it. His records, medical personnel, even his fingerprints were updated 2 weeks ago. Daniel's brow furrowed. Updated by who? Unknown, she said. It came from a restricted military network way above my clearance. Daniel exhaled sharply and rubbed the scar on his forearm, an old habit whenever he felt that old Marine instinct kicking in. You think someone's covering tracks? Evelyn's eyes met his. I think this man isn't supposed to be found. Just then, footsteps echoed down the corridor, measured, heavy, deliberate. Detective Marcus Hale, retired, military investigator turned consultant, stepped in. He looked every bit his 60 years, white beard, sharp eyes, raincoat still dripping. Ross, he greeted. Heard you stirred quite the scene at the chapel. Shadow did, Daniel corrected. He's the one who smelled something wrong. Hale gave the dog an approving nod. Smart animal. Smarter than most people I've worked with. Then his voice dropped. Listen, I just came from the morgue. They confirmed Cole's autopsy never happened. Daniel froze. Never happened. Hale shook his head. Paperwork says it was completed, but the body was released to the funeral home without a single incision. The pathologist who signed off vanished yesterday. The room went silent again. Even the rain seemed to hold its breath. Shadow rose to his feet, his ears pricking. A faint sound came from the hallway, a slow, steady rhythm of boots on linoleum. Daniel looked through the window and saw 2 men in dark suits walking toward Cole's ICU room. No badges, no name tags. He stepped into the hall. Can I help you, gentlemen? One of them flashed a quick smile. "We're here for routine follow-up, Mr. Ross. Classified orders." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Funny because I didn't see your names on the visitor list." The taller man's eyes shifted cold and measured. "You're not authorized to question that." Shadow stepped forward, teeth bared in silence. For a moment, no one moved. The air between them tightened like a drawn wire. Then the men turned away, disappearing into Cole's room. Evelyn appeared behind Daniel. "Who are they?" "Spooks," Hale muttered. "Government kind. Always arrive right before the truth does." They watched through the glass as the two strangers leaned over Cole's bed, checking monitors, whispering things only the machines could hear. Cole's face barely moved, but for a brief second Daniel swore he saw one corner of the man's mouth curl upward, almost like a smile. A cold realization crept over him. Maybe this wasn't a rescue. Maybe it was a return. Shadow pressed closer to his leg, whining softly. "Yeah," Daniel murmured, more to the dog than anyone else. "I smell it too." Outside, the storm began to build again, and somewhere deep in Willow Creek, something dark was waking something that had been buried under uniforms, medals, and lies. The rain had stopped by dusk, but Willow Creek still smelled of it, wet earth, pine needles, and something faintly metallic carried by the wind. Daniel parked his truck outside Colonel Cole's old lake house, a weathered structure that leaned toward the water like a tired soldier waiting for relief. The windows were dark, the porch light burned out, and the American flag out front hung limp, its colors faded by years of storms. Shadow jumped down first, his paws sinking into the damp soil. The German shepherd sniffed the air, tail rigid, then looked back at Daniel as if to say, "We're not alone here." Daniel unlocked the door with the spare key Cole had once given him years ago, back when trust still meant something. The hinges groaned as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and silence. A faint odor of old tobacco lingered, mixed with the faint sweetness of decay. He clicked on his flashlight. The beam cut across shelves lined with military memorabilia, framed medals, faded photographs, a folded flag, and a single picture of a younger Cole shaking hands with a general whose face Daniel couldn't quite place. Shadow began pacing slowly through the living room, nose close to the ground. His steps were deliberate, his breathing quiet. The dog stopped suddenly near the old bookcase against the far wall. He sniffed once, twice, then scratched at the base, tail flicking low. Daniel frowned. "What is it, boy?" He knelt and ran his hand along the edge of the floorboard. One of the planks felt loose. He pressed down. A hollow sound echoed beneath his palm. Daniel tugged the board up carefully. It gave way with a creak, and beneath it lay a metal latch covered in dust. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered. He pulled the latch. A section of the bookcase shifted with a faint click, revealing a narrow passage behind it just wide enough for a man to crawl through. Cold air rushed out, carrying the smell of oil and earth. Shadow growled low, but his body leaned forward, ready. "Stay close," Daniel murmured. They descended a short set of steps into a basement that didn't exist on any blueprint Daniel had ever seen. The air was damp and stale. A single bulb flickered weakly from the ceiling, casting long shadows that crawled across the concrete walls. What he saw made his stomach tighten. File cabinets lined one side of the room, labeled with code names and dates. A large corkboard hung on the wall, covered with maps and shipping routes marked in red string, and on a metal table in the center lay several sealed crates stamped with military insignias, Department of Defense, Restricted Cargo. Daniel brushed his hand across the nearest label. It read, "Bay Transfer Logistics, Confidential." His pulse quickened. That company had been shut down years ago after an internal scandal, illegal exports, missing aid shipments, rumors of arms deals. Cole had testified against them in a tribunal. Except Daniel muttered, flipping open one of the crates. Inside were stacks of printed manifests marked and signed by Colonel Richard Cole himself. Shadow stood by his side, ears back, tail stiff. He gave a low, uncertain whine. Daniel's throat felt dry. The more he read, the more impossible it became. Cole wasn't just a witness, he was involved. These weren't reports from an investigator. They were orders, approvals for transfers, signatures of clearance, authorization stamps that bore Cole's old military ID. He sat down heavily on a nearby crate, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. "What the hell were you doing, Rich?" he whispered. Shadow padded closer, placing his head on Daniel's knee. The dog's eyes reflected the dim light, calm but questioning, as if asking whether Daniel was ready to face what was coming. In one corner of the basement, a small safe stood half hidden under a tarp. Daniel knelt, brushing off the dust. The keypad was old, the kind used in field operations 2 decades ago. He stared at it for a moment, then typed a number that felt instinctive. 1109, Cole's old platoon number. The lock clicked open. Inside lay a single flash drive and a leather-bound notebook. The pages were filled with shorthand notations, coded phrases, and hand-drawn symbols. But one line stood out, written in Cole's unmistakable handwriting: "When the tide turns, vanish with the storm. Leave no trail behind." Daniel exhaled, slowly closing the notebook. The handwriting wasn't rushed or desperate, it was planned. He heard something outside. A soft creak from the porch, followed by footsteps measured, cautious. He clicked off the flashlight, plunging the room into near darkness. Shadow tensed, body low, ready to strike. Through the thin vent near the stairs, Daniel could see a faint light sweeping across the living room above them. Someone else was here. He whispered, "Quiet." The beam of a flashlight passed over the walls, lingering on the empty bookcase now swung open. Whoever it was stopped right above them. Then came a slow, deliberate tapping sound, metal against wood, like someone counting. Shadow's body trembled with restraint. The sound moved toward the door, then faded into the night. Minutes passed before Daniel exhaled again. He stood slowly, every instinct screaming that this was no coincidence. Someone knew he'd be here. Someone wanted to make sure he found just enough to start asking questions, but not enough to stop. He pocketed the flash drive, secured the notebook, and looked down at Shadow. "Looks like you were right again, old boy," he whispered, the dead man still pulling strings. As they stepped out into the cool night air, the pine trees surrounding the lake whispered softly in the wind, their branches creaking like voices too old to speak clearly. Daniel looked back once more at the dark windows of the house. A faint glimmer flickered behind one of them, like a reflection of eyes watching. He turned toward the truck. "Come on, Shadow," he said quietly. "It's time to wake some ghosts." The rain came back with the darkness. By the time Daniel and Shadow reached the edge of Willow Creek, the town was half asleep under a sheet of silver mist. The streetlights glowed dimly, halos of yellow in the fog. The little chapel stood at the hill's crest, its windows dark, its bells silent, the cross on its roof gleaming faintly in the rain. Daniel stepped out of the truck, pulling his coat tight. The gravel crunched beneath his boots. Shadow moved beside him, his coat already slick from the drizzle, ears twitching at every distant sound, the rattle of loose shutters, the hum of wind through the pines. Daniel had come back for one reason. After what he found in Cole's house, the files, the hidden room, the coded message, something didn't fit. Why would Cole keep proof of his own crimes? Unless he knew someone else might come looking. Unless he wanted someone to. He reached the chapel steps. The door was supposed to be locked at night, but the latch gave easily under his hand. It creaked open. Inside it was dark except for the faint moonlight spilling through stained glass. The air smelled of old wood and wilting flowers. The casket that had once held Colonel Cole still rested near the altar, now closed again after the chaos of the funeral. A single wreath lay toppled beside it. Shadow walked ahead, nose to the ground. He sniffed along the pews, then stopped halfway up the aisle. His body stiffened. A low growl rolled from his chest. Daniel froze. "What is it?" The answer came in the form of a voice, smooth, calm, and strangely familiar. "Evening, Mr. Ross. Didn't expect to see anyone here at this hour." A man stood near the front, emerging from the shadows between the pews. He wore a long navy overcoat, perfectly dry despite the rain, and a gray scarf wrapped neatly around his collar. His shoes gleamed under the faint light, too clean for a muddy night. His hair was dark, combed straight back, and his eyes, gray and unreadable, watched Daniel with polite curiosity. "Name's Thomas Grant," the man said, smiling faintly. "I worked with Colonel Cole a few years back. We served on a joint logistics project, classified, of course. I was told I could pay my respects tonight." Daniel didn't lower his guard. "By who?" Grant shrugged. "Someone from the base. Maybe someone who doesn't exist." You know how it is. He spoke easily like a man accustomed to disarming people with words. But Shadow didn't buy it. The shepherd's hackles rose his tail straight as a line. He growled, deeper eyes locked not on Grant but on the casket. Daniel followed the dog's gaze. The casket sat perfectly still, yet something about it felt wrong. The flag had been removed after the funeral, replaced by a plain white drape. Rainwater from a leak in the roof had darkened one corner of the cloth. Shadow stepped closer, nose twitching. Then he barked once, sharp, commanding. Grant's expression didn't change, but his eyes flicked briefly toward the casket. Still well-trained, he said softly, "Old habits die hard." Daniel took a step forward. "You said you served with Cole. What unit?" Grant hesitated just for a second too long. "It was Logistics Command. Overseas operations." "Funny," Daniel said, voice low. "Because I served under him for 7 years and he never once mentioned you." Grant's smile faded. "Maybe he didn't tell you everything." The air between them grew taut, the kind of silence that precedes violence. Shadow moved in front of Daniel, his body half-crouched ready. Then faintly from the altar a sound. A dull, hollow thump, like something shifting inside wood. Daniel turned sharply. "You hear that?" Grant didn't move. "Probably the wind," he said too quickly. Another thump. This one louder. Shadow barked, leaping toward the casket. His paws hit the side with a heavy thud, claws scraping the polished surface. He whined and barked again, more frantic this time. "Step back," Daniel shouted, drawing closer. Grant's voice turned cold. "Don't open that." Daniel's eyes snapped to him. "Why not?" "Because some things," Grant said, "are better left buried." But Daniel was already at the coffin. His hands gripped the lid. The hinges protested as he forced it open. The inside was empty. The satin lining was torn, one corner soaked with something dark and sticky blood not yet dry. Daniel's stomach dropped. "Where is he?" he whispered. Grant didn't answer. When Daniel turned, the man was gone. The chapel door swung slightly open, rain blowing in through the gap. Shadow barked, lunging toward the exit. Daniel followed, but when he stepped outside, the night had swallowed everything. Only footprints in the wet gravel remained, leading down the hill and disappearing into the fog near the road. He stood there for a long moment, the rain dripping from his coat. Shadow pressed close to his leg. Cole's body was gone. The man who claimed to mourn him had vanished. And the one witness Daniel could trust had 4 legs and a sense no human could match. "Come on, boy," he said softly. "We're not done yet." They walked back toward the truck, the sound of the creek echoing faintly below. The pines whispered overhead, their needles hissing in the wind. Somewhere in that murmur, Daniel thought he could almost hear a voice, a low, distant echo that might have been his imagination. "When the tide turns, vanish with the storm." The same words from Cole's hidden notebook. Daniel turned the phrase over in his mind as he looked back at the chapel one last time. The cross glimmered faintly through the rain, a beacon over an empty coffin. "Looks like you did vanish, Rich," he muttered. "But the storm's not done with you yet." Shadow whined softly, then barked once as if agreeing. Together, man and dog disappeared into the fog, leaving behind a chapel full of secrets and a silence heavy enough to break faith. The wind over Willow Creek carried the smell of a coming storm. Clouds rolled in low and heavy, pressing against the town like a weight. Inside Willow Creek Military Medical Center, the world was lit in sterile white. The hallways hummed with the soft rhythm of machines and the distant drip of rainwater through a leaky vent. Daniel Ross hadn't left the hospital since the night he found Colonel Cole's coffin empty. He sat outside the ICU, elbows on his knees, eyes heavy but sharp. Shadow lay at his feet, his head resting on his paws, tail curled close to his body. Every few minutes the dog lifted his nose, sniffed the air, then settled again, uneasy but patient. Cole was in the room beyond the glass, unconscious, breathing slow and shallow. 2 heart monitors blinked softly beside him, the only proof the man still clung to life. Dr. Evelyn Ward stepped quietly out of the room, her tired eyes meeting Daniel's. "His vitals are holding," she said, "but he hasn't regained consciousness." Daniel nodded. "Maybe he doesn't want to." She studied him for a moment. "You still think he staged all this himself?" I don't think, Daniel said flatly. I know. Before she could reply, the lights flickered. Once. Twice. Then the hallway went black. The silence that followed was deafening, only the hum of backup batteries. Then the low mechanical click as the emergency lights stuttered to life, bathing the corridor in a pulsing red glow. Power outage, Evelyn whispered. Daniel stood up, his instincts kicking in. Not a normal one. Shadow was already on his feet, body tense, nose high. He let out a low growl, a sound Daniel hadn't heard since Kandahar. Then came the sound of footsteps, light, deliberate, moving fast from the far end of the hall. Stay here, Daniel said, drawing his flashlight from his belt. Lock this door. But before Evelyn could move, the sound changed direction, closer now, down the side corridor that led to Cole's room. Shadow, Daniel hissed. The dog took off silent and sure, disappearing into the red haze. Daniel followed his flashlight, cutting a thin beam through the gloom. At the intersection, he caught a glimpse of movement. A figure in hospital scrubs and a surgical mask, pushing a medical cart toward the ICU. Hey, Daniel shouted. The figure didn't stop. He sprinted forward, heart hammering, just as Shadow lunged from the shadows, teeth flashing. The shepherd hit the man square in the back, dragging him to the ground. The cart toppled, spilling a tray of syringes across the floor. Daniel grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it behind his back. The mask fell away, revealing a narrow, familiar face. Sharp cheekbones, cold eyes. Cole, Daniel breathed, but no, not Richard Cole. It was Raymond Cole, the colonel's younger brother, a man Daniel hadn't seen since the desert. He looked older now, leaner, but the same icy arrogance gleamed in his eyes. Let me go, Raymond hissed. You don't understand. I understand plenty, Daniel said, pressing a knee into his back. You're breaking into your brother's room in disguise during a power cut. That about covers it. Raymond laughed, a dry, humorless sound. Brother, that man in there isn't Richard. He's a ghost. Daniel froze. What are you talking about? He's been dead for months, Raymond spat. Whoever's in that bed, it isn't him. My brother burned in an accident overseas. The body they brought back was ashes. I signed the report myself. Daniel's grip tightened. Then who's lying in that room? Raymond looked up, his voice low and venomous. Someone wearing his face. Shadow growled, teeth bared inches from the man's throat. Before Daniel could question further, a new sound sliced through the hallway, the metallic click of a gun being cocked. Stand up. Mr. Ross, came a calm voice from the far end of the corridor. Daniel turned slowly. A man stood under the emergency light, wearing a long coat over civilian clothes. His face was pale, expression unreadable. The faint trace of a smirk curled one corner of his mouth. Thomas Grant. He stepped closer, weapon steady in his hand. Let the lieutenant colonel go, he said softly. He's not your problem. You again, Daniel muttered. You were at the chapel. Grant's smile widened. And you still don't know when to stop asking questions. Shadow barked sharply, a warning. The sound echoed off the concrete. Daniel's mind worked fast. Grant wasn't alone. He could see a shadow moving behind him. Another armed man, maybe two. They were moving in a triangle, closing the trap. He whispered, "Shadow down." The dog sank low to the ground, muscles coiled. Grant raised the gun higher. Last chance, Sergeant. Walk away. Daniel met his gaze. You've got the wrong man, friend. I already buried one liar this week. Then in a blur of movement, Shadow lunged. The hallway exploded in chaos, gunfire, cracked bullets sparking off metal. Daniel threw himself sideways, tackling Raymond against the wall as Shadow hit Grant square in the chest, jaws clamping down on his gun arm. Grant screamed, trying to twist free, but the shepherd held firm. Daniel grabbed a fallen syringe from the floor and slammed it into Raymond's wrist. The man gasped, the sedative taking hold almost instantly. Shadow off, Daniel barked. The dog released, panting hard, his muzzle streaked with blood. Grant fell back, clutching his arm, his weapon clattering to the floor. For a moment, everything froze. The red lights flickered again, the power grid groaning back to life. In that flash of white light, Daniel saw Grant's face clearly, no panic, no pain, just cold fury. Then he turned and bolted toward the stairwell. Shadow, Daniel shouted. The dog chased claws, skidding across the linoleum, but by the time they reached the door, Grant was gone, vanished into the maze of staircases and shadows below. Daniel stood there, chest heaving, the acrid smell of gunpowder still hanging in the air. Evelyn ran up the corridor, breathless. What happened? Daniel turned to her, still gripping the sedative syringe. Somebody just tried to finish the job. Inside the ICU, the steady beep of Cole's monitor continued, indifferent to the chaos. The man in the bed lay motionless, too still, too composed. Daniel stared through the glass, his reflection merging with Cole's face. "I don't know who you are," he whispered, "but I'll find out." Shadow pressed against his leg, his fur-bristling eyes never leaving the ICU door. The storm outside broke in earnest thunder, rolling over Willow Creek like the sound of distant artillery. And somewhere in the dark corridors of that hospital, Thomas Grant was still out there, watching, waiting, and planning the next move. The rain had passed by dawn, leaving Willow Creek wrapped in a pale, smoky mist. The town woke slowly. Coffee shops opening, porch lights flickering on the world, pretending nothing strange had happened the night before. But Daniel Ross knew better. The storm had only changed shape. He hadn't slept. He couldn't. Images from the hospital replayed in his mind, the flash of the gun, the red light pulsing down the corridor, the man who called himself Thomas Grant, vanishing into the stairwell. And the words of Raymond Cole. "That man isn't my brother." By mid-morning, Daniel drove across town to the quiet edge of the valley where Evelyn Ward lived. Her house sat behind a grove of sycamores, small and plain, with a vegetable garden that had gone to weeds. She had retired from military medicine years ago, but she still kept the neat habits of her service porch-swept boots by the door curtains half drawn. When Daniel knocked, she didn't open immediately. A moment later, the door creaked and her lined face appeared in the crack. "I figured you'd show up sooner or later," she said. Daniel nodded. "I need answers, Evie." She sighed, stepping aside. "You'd better come in." The house smelled faintly of herbs and coffee. Books lined the shelves, medical journals, field manuals, and a few old family photos tucked between them. Shadow padded in behind Daniel, sniffing curiously, then lying near the fireplace, eyes half closed but listening. Evelyn poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs. "You look worse than the night we pulled you out of Helmand," she said softly. Daniel took the cup, managing a small smile. "I feel worse." For a long moment, neither spoke. The clock on the wall ticked steady and slow. Finally, Daniel said, "I know Cole was into something dirty. I saw his files, arms shipments, false manifests, all signed by him. But that's not what keeps me up. It's what I saw at the hospital. That man, it's him, but it isn't." Evelyn's hand stilled around her cup. "You already knew, didn't you?" Daniel asked quietly. Her eyes lifted, full of guilt. "Yes." He waited. She exhaled the sound like air escaping a long-sealed chamber. "A few months ago, before his so-called death, Richard Cole came to me out of nowhere. Said he needed a favor. He wanted his medical file updated, DNA markers, retinal scan, even fingerprints. Claimed it was part of a classified recovery project. I told him it couldn't be done without authorization, but he brought documents top clearance signed by names I recognized." Daniel frowned. "Real names?" "Real signatures," she said. "But forged authorization. I didn't see it at the time." She rose, walking to a small metal cabinet near the window. From the bottom drawer, she pulled out a worn envelope. "I kept a copy," she said, handing it to him. Inside were digital prints, blood-type data, fingerprint overlays, and a report dated 6 weeks before Cole's heart attack. The biometric data didn't match. Not perfectly. A few markers were altered, small enough to pass most scans, but enough to raise suspicion. Daniel's voice was low. "So he built himself a new identity." Evelyn nodded. "New ID, new file, clean as snow. But here's the part that chilled me. He wasn't hiding from enemies. He was hiding from friends." Shadow lifted his head, ears pricking. He gave a low growl, the same one that always came before a storm or a lie. Evelyn looked down at the dog. "He knows, doesn't he?" Daniel reached to calm Shadow, but he didn't need to. The shepherd stood, moving toward the hallway, nose to the air. Then he stopped near the closed back door, sniffing once, twice, then barked sharp and certain. Daniel moved quickly, gun drawn, yanking the door open. Nothing. Just rain dripping from the gutter, the faint imprint of boots in the mud fresh. When he came back inside, Evelyn was standing stiffly by the counter, her hand trembling. "They're watching me," she whispered. "Ever since I spoke with the military board, they said I wasn't to discuss Cole's records. I thought they meant for his protection." Daniel's tone hardened. "You've got to leave town, Evie." She shook her head. "No. If they wanted me gone, I'd be gone. I think they're waiting to see how much you know." He looked down at the envelope again, then at her weary face. "Why didn't you tell me before?" Because she said softly, "The last time someone tried to tell the truth about Cole, they disappeared." Silence filled the kitchen. The clock ticked louder now, each second like a hammer. Finally, Evelyn walked to a drawer and pulled out a small flash drive, pressing it into Daniel's hand. "There's more. Copies of his updated ID and the requisition orders for biometric transfer. Take it." Daniel pocketed it carefully. "You just signed your own target order." "Maybe," she said. "But if you're right, if that man in the hospital isn't Cole, then someone needs to finish what he started. Whatever he became, he was still a soldier once." Shadow gave another low bark, this time not at the door but toward the hallway leading to the front. Daniel turned. Through the curtains, headlights flickered 2 cars idling quietly at the end of the drive. Evelyn's voice dropped. "They found us." Daniel grabbed his coat. "Through the back now." But before they could move, the sound of tires crunching gravel grew louder. A man's silhouette appeared at the window, tall, wearing a hat against the rain. The porch boards creaked. Evelyn gripped Daniel's arm. "If I don't make it, promise me one thing." "What's that?" "Don't let them rewrite this story." The front door rattled, a firm knock echoing through the small house. Daniel motioned to Shadow, whispering, "Guard." The shepherd crept toward the entryway, silent as a shadow. The knock came again, louder. Then a voice, calm, almost pleasant. "Evening, Ms. Ward. We need to ask a few questions about an old friend." Daniel's hand tightened on his pistol. Evelyn whispered, "That voice, I know it." The door handle turned. Daniel met her eyes. "Get to the car." He turned toward the doorway, muscles tense, ready. The rain outside started again, soft, steady, like a warning. Shadow's body stiffened. His growl deepened, and for one long breath time seemed to stop. Then the latch clicked open, and the man who stepped into the light was smiling the same polite, polished smile Daniel had seen once before at the chapel. Thomas Grant. The rain came harder as night fell, drumming against the windshield of Daniel's truck like 1,000 impatient fingers. He drove with the headlights off, following only the faint shimmer of wet pavement ahead. Shadow sat alert in the passenger seat, chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, his eyes scanning the dark beyond the glass. Behind them, Evelyn's house was already a blur of red and blue flashing lights painting the mist as distant sirens approached. Daniel hadn't stayed to find out who fired first. He'd dragged Evelyn through the back garden, shoved her into her own car, and told her to drive east toward Asheville. Then he'd turned the truck toward the one place he still had unfinished business, Cole's lake house. The closer he got, the heavier his heart felt. Each mile brought back voices, commands shouted under mortar fire, laughter over cheap coffee in Afghanistan, the quiet bond only soldiers shared. But now those memories had soured. Everything about Cole, his medals, his hero's speeches, felt like echoes from a play written for fools. He turned off the road onto the muddy trail leading to the lake. The house appeared through the fog like a ghost, its windows black, its reflection rippling faintly on the water. Shadow leapt from the truck the moment the engine stopped. His paws hit the ground soft and sure. The dog moved ahead without command, nose low, tracing a scent invisible to man. Daniel followed, flashlight in one hand, pistol in the other. "Stay close, boy." But Shadow didn't wait. He trotted straight to the porch, sniffed the door frame, then let out a sharp bark once decisive. Daniel frowned. "Someone's been here." He tried the door. It opened easily, hinges still damp from the last storm. Inside, the air was colder than before. The faint smell of gun oil and wet wool hung in the room. Shadow padded across the floor, stopping where the bookcase had once hidden the entrance to the secret basement. The dog sniffed the air, then began to scratch at the floorboards. His growl rumbled deep, not fear, but recognition. Daniel knelt beside him, lifting the panel again. The latch gave way, revealing the narrow stairway below. "Go," he whispered. Shadow descended first, his silhouette moving like a wraith through the beam of Daniel's flashlight. When Daniel reached the bottom, he froze. The basement wasn't as he'd left it. The files were gone, the crates were open empty. The corkboard had been stripped bare, only a few torn strings dangled where maps once hung. Whoever had come here had cleaned house. But Shadow was fixated on something else. He moved toward the corner where the safe had been sniffed once, then began pawing at the concrete floor. The dog's claws clicked against metal. Daniel knelt and brushed aside the dust, a small vent cover freshly replaced. "Good boy," he muttered, prying it open. Inside was a small rusted tin box. Daniel lifted it out carefully and flipped the latch. Inside were a few photographs, yellowed papers, and a tiny solid-state drive wrapped in cloth. He unfolded the first photo. His breath caught. It showed Cole alive and smiling, standing beside a shipping container at some foreign port. Behind him were men Daniel didn't recognize, armed civilians, not soldiers. And in the corner of the photo, printed on the side of a crate, was a symbol Daniel did recognize, a red falcon with spread wings, the mark of an international weapons syndicate he'd fought years ago. The second photo was worse. It showed Cole shaking hands with Thomas Grant, both men in civilian clothes, standing under a banner that read, "Bay Transfer Logistics, Private Partnership." Daniel stared at it for a long moment. Then quietly he said, "You bastard." Shadow stood beside him, tail stiff, a low growl vibrating through the silence. Daniel inserted the small drive into his field laptop, the screen flickering to life. Files filled the display: invoices, shipping manifests, encrypted documents, and a series of payments routed through offshore accounts. Every signature was the same: Colonel Richard Cole. It all made sense now. The death, the empty coffin, the missing body, the mysterious Grant. Cole hadn't been murdered. He had orchestrated everything: his own poisoning, his own resurrection. It was the perfect cover to die a hero so he could be reborn as someone untouchable. Daniel leaned back, the weight of it pressing down on him. "You didn't run from them," he whispered. "You ran from us." Shadow's ears twitched suddenly. He looked toward the stairs, body tense. A sound echoed faintly from above, the groan of wood under a cautious footstep. Daniel killed the laptop screen and drew his pistol. The sound came again, slow, deliberate. He whispered, "Down." Shadow crouched low, eyes locked on the stairwell. The faint glow from outside flickered against the wall as the front door creaked open. Then footsteps, heavier this time, not even trying to hide. A beam of light swept across the basement wall. Daniel ducked behind a crate, gun ready. Shadow growled softly, the fur along his spine bristling. A man's voice echoed down the steps. Calm, confident, familiar. "You never could let sleeping dogs lie, could you?" Ross Daniel's blood turned cold. He stepped out slowly, flashlight raised. The man at the bottom of the stairs was tall, lean, wearing a civilian coat over a gray uniform shirt, and the face staring back at him was unmistakable. Colonel Richard Cole. He was supposed to be in a hospital bed, unconscious, barely alive. But here he stood, eyes clear, posture straight, a faint smirk pulling at his lips. Surprised, Cole said, descending the last step. "You were always good at digging where you shouldn't." Daniel's voice was low, steady. "You faked your death." All this time, why, Cole smiled, but his eyes were empty. "Because the world doesn't reward loyalty, Ross. It rewards power. You of all people should know that. I built something bigger than the Corps ever gave me, and I wasn't about to let bureaucrats bury it. You were selling weapons rich. To enemies." "Not enemies," Cole corrected. "Clients." Shadow barked, breaking the silence, his voice echoing off the concrete. Cole's eyes flicked toward the dog, and for a moment, something like regret crossed his face. Still with the same mutt, he murmured, "Loyal to the end." Daniel's finger tightened on the trigger. "You made him that way." Cole took a slow step forward, palms open. "Don't do something foolish, Sergeant. You can't stop what's already in motion. You can only decide whether you want to survive it." Thunder rolled above them, shaking the walls. The wind howled through the cracks of the old lake house. Daniel steadied his aim. "You should have stayed dead." Cole smiled faintly. "Maybe I never was alive to begin with." Then came a crash, glass breaking upstairs, footsteps pounding across the floor. Someone else had arrived. Cole's eyes flicked upward sharp. "They're early," he hissed. "You brought them here." Before Daniel could answer, Cole turned and ran up the stairs, disappearing into the storm. Shadow barked and lunged after him. "Shadow, wait!" Daniel shouted, but the dog was already gone. He grabbed the tin box and sprinted after them, his heart-pounding thunder roaring overhead. And in that instant, as lightning split the sky over Willow Creek, Daniel realized something chilling. Cole hadn't planned to vanish this time. He was ready to fight. The night tore itself open with thunder. Rain lashed the lake house in furious sheets, rattling the broken shutters and shaking the trees along the shore. Daniel burst through the doorway, the storm swallowing his breath. Shadow was already a blur ahead of him, paws pounding against the mud, following the trail of Colonel Richard Cole, or whoever that man really was. Lightning flashed, revealing footprints cutting through the soaked grass toward the old storage warehouses near the dock. The structures had long been abandoned remnants of a time when Willow Creek shipped lumber instead of secrets. Daniel's boots splashed through puddles as he ran, soaked to the bone but fueled by something deeper than anger. Betrayal. He had buried too many good men for Cole to be one of the bad ones. But Shadow's instincts had never failed him before, and tonight the dog was certain. Another flash illuminated the dock ahead. A man sprinted across it, his silhouette cutting through the downpour, a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Cole turned once, the lightning catching the side of his face, half hidden behind a strip of medical tape that ran from jaw to temple. Daniel stopped cold. For the first time he saw what he'd missed in the hospital, the faint unevenness of skin tone, the way the features seemed almost sculpted. Skin grafts, he realized. Reconstruction. He wasn't just hiding. He'd rebuilt himself. Cole, Daniel shouted into the storm, "It's over." Cole turned, his voice barely audible over the wind. "You never understood, Ross. You can't fight the system. You have to own it." Then he vanished into the warehouse. Shadow growled and bolted forward. Daniel followed, kicking the door open. The interior was vast and echoing, lit only by flashes of lightning bleeding through shattered windows. Rusted cranes hung from the ceiling like skeletal arms. Crates stacked high formed narrow aisles that stretched into darkness. Water dripped steadily from the rafters, pooling on the concrete floor. "Shadow," Daniel whispered. "Find him." The shepherd lowered his head, sniffed once, and moved into the maze of crates, silent as mist. Daniel followed close behind, gun drawn. Somewhere deeper inside, metal clanged against metal. The sound of a latch, a lock, a door closing. Daniel edged around a corner, flashlight sweeping. Shadows leapt and twisted with each flash of lightning. He caught movement, a reflection off glass, the gleam of an open case. Inside it, faint under the dust, were rows of passports. Dozens of them. Different names, different faces, but all with one identical set of eyes. The last passport lay open on the table, its photo showing a clean-shaven man with short gray hair and calm blue eyes. Name, Richard Gray. Daniel whispered, "So that's who you became." Behind him a voice answered, calm as ever. "And who I've always been in one way or another." Daniel spun. Cole, no. Gray stood a few yards away, pistol in hand, rain dripping from his coat. His face looked different now under the harsh light, smoother, sharper, almost too perfect. But his eyes were the same steel blue Daniel remembered from 100 war briefings. "You think I didn't earn this?" Cole said, stepping closer. "Every medal, every mission, they used me, Ross. We both know what happens to good soldiers. They get forgotten. I decided to rewrite the rules. By selling out your country," Daniel snapped. "By surviving it." Thunder rolled again, shaking the building. Shadow appeared from the shadows, silent, deadly, circling behind Cole. The dog's eyes burned amber under the flicker of lightning. He gave a low growl. Cole froze. "Call him off," Cole said quietly. Daniel didn't move. "He doesn't take orders from traitors." Cole's hand twitched. "Last warning, Ross. I can still make you part of this. Walk away." Daniel took a step forward. "You already buried yourself once. Why not finish the job?" The two men stood locked in silence, rain hammering against the tin roof. Then Cole moved first, lifting his gun. A single flash erupted. The sound of the shot was drowned by thunder. Daniel hit the ground, rolling behind a crate, the bullet splintering wood inches from his head. Shadow lunged, teeth bared, hitting Cole square in the chest. The gun skidded across the wet floor. Cole struggled, shouting, "You stupid animal!" He grabbed a metal rod, striking hard, but Shadow held fast, jaws clamped on his arm. Daniel rushed forward, kicking the weapon away, slamming Cole against a pillar. "Look at me," Daniel roared. "Look at what you've become." Cole gasped, eyes wild. "I became free." He twisted suddenly, pushing Daniel back. The movement tore a flap of synthetic skin loose from his cheek, revealing pale scar tissue beneath stitches and grafts that didn't belong. The sight froze Daniel where he stood. Cole's voice broke almost human for the first time. "You think I wanted this? You think any of it was choice? They built me, Ross. And when I wouldn't keep quiet, they tried to erase me. So I erased myself first." Daniel steadied his aim, rain dripping from his gun. "You erased your soul long before that." Cole's shoulders slumped. "Maybe. But I'm still breathing. And that's more than most of them can say." Shadow barked once, short, decisive. Outside, the wind howled louder, the storm reaching its peak. Lightning burst through the open windows, flooding the room in blinding white. In that split second, Daniel saw Cole's face clearly torn between defiance and despair. Then the old roof gave way. A thunderous crack echoed as one of the support beams collapsed, sending a cascade of debris crashing down. Daniel dove aside, shielding his head. Shadow darted clear, but Cole wasn't fast enough. The beam struck the floor beside him, pinning his leg under splintered wood. The gun lay just beyond his reach. Daniel approached slowly, weapon raised, but Cole didn't grab for his gun. He just looked up, rainwater streaming down his face, the smirk gone. "It's over," Daniel said. Cole gave a ragged laugh. "Nothing's ever over. Check my left pocket." Daniel hesitated, then reached in. A flash drive. Waterproof. Unmarked. "You'll see the truth," Cole whispered. "All of it. You'll see what they made me do." Daniel looked down at him. "What do you want me to do with it?" Cole's lips twitched. "Bury it or burn it. Either way, make sure the dog gets a medal." Before Daniel could reply, a final bolt of lightning struck nearby, shaking the structure again. The lights flickered and went out completely. When the thunder faded, the only sound left was the steady drip of rain and Shadow's soft panting. Cole was gone. Daniel knelt beside the rubble. There was no body, just the echo of the storm and the faint smell of gunpowder and smoke. Shadow pressed close, resting his head against Daniel's leg, eyes full of something deeper than fear understanding. "Yeah," Daniel whispered, staring into the darkness. "I saw it too." Outside, the storm began to break. The wind softened the first light of dawn, bleeding over Willow Creek. But for Daniel, the world had already changed. He wasn't chasing ghosts anymore. He was standing in their ashes. The storm broke at dawn. By the time Daniel and Shadow reached town, the streets were washed clean, the lake glimmering under a pale gray sky. The chaos of the night felt distant now, like a fever dream left behind in the fog. But Daniel knew better. Some storms don't end when the clouds clear. He sat in a government office overlooking Willow Creek Harbor, a place once filled with fishing boats but now dominated by patrol vessels and black SUVs. The federal task force had moved in overnight, sealing off every road and warehouse around the lake. Armed agents in windbreakers combed through the wreckage of Cole's storage complex. Across the room, Agent Naomi Trent, from the Department of Defense's Criminal Intelligence Division, stood over a table covered with evidence bags. Her gray suit was immaculate despite the sleepless night, and her voice carried the sharp calm of someone long accustomed to the ugliness of truth. She glanced at Daniel. "You brought us quite a story, Mr. Ross." He said nothing. He sat slouched in a metal chair, still wearing his soaked jacket, hands clasped around a mug of bitter coffee that had long gone cold. Shadow lay near the door, head on his paws, eyes half closed, but alert, always alert. Naomi held up the small flash drive Daniel had taken from Cole's pocket. "This little thing might burn down half a career field," she said. "Weapons trafficking, human smuggling, falsified shipments, black money. It's all here. Every transaction signed by your colonel." Daniel's jaw tightened. He wasn't my colonel anymore. Naomi gave a faint nod. "We decrypted part of it. Cole wasn't working alone. He was part of a group called the Harbor Line, a shadow network using retired officers to move contraband under military cover. Every few months, one of them would die on paper, assume a new identity, and keep the business alive. She paused, her expression softening slightly. You've seen what that kind of system does to men. Turns them into ghosts, long before the grave does. Daniel stared out the window. Down below, federal agents hauled crates from the warehouses. He could see the logo painted on each container, a red falcon with outstretched wings, the same mark from the photograph Shadow had found. Any sign of Cole's body? He asked quietly. Naomi shook her head. Not yet. The building collapsed into the lake. Divers will search when it's safe. But whether he's dead or not? She hesitated. He's finished. Daniel didn't answer. Shadow lifted his head, ears twitching at the distant sound of a helicopter over the harbor. The dog's eyes followed it until it vanished into the clouds. Naomi walked to the other end of the room and placed a folder on the desk in front of him. There's more. Cole kept recordings, conversations, orders, names. He wasn't just part of the ring, he was the architect. We've identified a half-dozen high-ranking officials. One of them's a sitting admiral. Daniel looked up. The Harbor King. Naomi nodded slowly. The nickname fits. And thanks to you, his kingdom just crumbled. He gave a tired smile, the kind that never reached his eyes. Don't thank me. Thank the dog. At that, Shadow wagged his tail once as if understanding. Naomi smiled faintly. We will. He's already getting his own report filed. Operational detection canine, unauthorized but effective. That might be a first. Daniel leaned back, exhaustion heavy in his bones. What happens now? Naomi crossed her arms. You go home, Mr. Ross. We'll take it from here. He studied her for a long moment, then said, and when the next one like Cole rises up, when the next good man decides the world owes him a crown? She met his gaze evenly. Then we hope there's another man like you, and another dog like him. That afternoon, Daniel drove back toward his cabin overlooking the creek. The sky was clearing, sunlight breaking through the thinning clouds. The air smelled of wet pine and salt. Shadow sat in the back seat watching the road unwind behind them. His fur was still damp, his left paw bandaged from the fight, but his eyes were calm. At the edge of town they passed the old chapel. Its windows gleamed again in the light, and for a moment Daniel thought of that first day, the empty coffin, the barking, the impossible truth that had started it all. He slowed the truck, looking toward the front steps. A new wreath of lilies rested beside the door, its ribbon white as snow. He whispered, You knew from the start, didn't you, boy? Shadow lifted his head, ears perking. His gaze followed the chapel until it disappeared behind the trees. When they reached the cabin, Daniel let him out. The air was cool, the lake surface calm at last. He stood for a long while at the water's edge, the reflection of the clouds trembling in the ripples. Somewhere beneath that surface lay the wreckage of Cole's empire, and maybe Cole himself. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small piece of cloth, the corner of a photo that had survived the fire. In it, Cole stood smiling beside his men, the same smile Daniel remembered before the world turned gray. He folded it carefully and placed it in the fire pit by the porch. The paper curled, blackened, then disappeared in a thin thread of smoke. Shadow came to stand beside him, pressing his shoulder against Daniel's leg. The gesture was simple, wordless, but it grounded him. Let's go home, Daniel said softly. We've done our part. The dog barked once, quiet, certain, and followed as Daniel walked back toward the cabin. Behind them, the sun broke through the last veil of clouds, casting long beams across the silent lake. For the first time in weeks, Willow Creek looked peaceful. But deep down, Daniel knew peace was never permanent. It was something you earned one truth at a time. And for now, at least, the truth had come to light. The years had softened Willow Creek. The lake no longer whispered of secrets, only of wind and pine. The old dock had been rebuilt, the chapel repainted white, and children's laughter now echoed where sirens once screamed. On a quiet summer evening, Daniel Ross sat in a wooden chair under the porch roof of his cabin, the sunset spilling gold over the water. His hair was silver now, his back slightly bent, but his eyes still carried that same calm steel that had seen both war and mercy. Beside him lay Shadow, old and slow, his muzzle gray breathing deep and even. The shepherd no longer ran through storms or chased ghosts in the dark, but when Daniel spoke, his ears still lifted, as if the old instincts never truly left. A few neighborhood children sat cross-legged on the porch steps, their faces lit by the fading light. They'd come every few weeks, drawn by the old man's stories about soldiers and dogs, about loyalty and choices that shape a lifetime. One of them, a boy no older than 10, looked up and asked, "Mr. Ross, is it true your dog once saved a man from a coffin?" Daniel chuckled softly, the sound like gravel and kindness mixed together. "That's what they say," he replied. "But the truth is, he didn't save a man. He saved what was left of one." The children frowned, puzzled. Daniel looked toward the lake where ripples caught the evening light. "Sometimes," he said gently, "God sends help in ways we don't expect. A bark when no one listens. A friend when you've got none left. Maybe even a dog when all you have is silence." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of pine and rain-soaked earth. Shadow stirred his cloudy eyes, following the light that danced on the water. Daniel reached down, his old hand resting on the shepherd's neck. "You remember that day, boy?" he whispered. "You knew before any of us." The dog's tail thumped once, faint but sure. The children were quiet now, sensing something sacred in the air. Daniel smiled at them, eyes glistening. "You see, courage isn't about fighting. It's about staying. Staying beside someone when the world tells you to walk away." The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in fire. Shadow lifted his head, looked toward the horizon, and let out one last soft bark, not loud, not urgent, just enough to break the silence. Daniel's smile deepened. "That's right," he said softly. "You tell them, old boy." The children looked at each other, unsure what to say. But Daniel just leaned back, hand resting on Shadow's fur, eyes fixed on the fading light over the still, forgiving lake. The world had changed, but in that moment, under the hum of cicadas and the whisper of the pines, it felt whole again. And somewhere in the quiet between heartbeats, a loyal soul finally rested. Sometimes life gives us one last companion to remind us what loyalty really means. Daniel and Shadow's story isn't just about war or secrets, it's about love that never asks for anything in return. Maybe we don't all get a miracle, but we all get a chance to be one for someone else. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. And if you've ever loved a dog, truly loved one, hit that subscribe button. Because here, every story we tell is a reminder that faith, friendship, and hope are never really gone. May God bless you, and may your loyal friend always be near.